Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Alexandra Marshall, who is the host of Curtain Call, a good sauce show exploring the leading personalities in the culture war. She writes on liberty, philosophy, and geopolitics. She's also an AI database designer for the retail industry and a contributor to multiple online journals. We'll be discussing themes she's been covering in articles for The Spectator, such as an amazing piece she just published called Digital Darkness, the Third Apocalypse. Just a quick reminder for podcast listeners to sign up to the email list, Telegram, Twitter, and all other media channels. Also consider leaving a one-time or monthly donation via Subscribestar, PayPal, or crypto. I've been freed of my day job and my only income is this podcast, so I appreciate all support. Alexandra, you're in Australia. How are things out there? Are you still in lockdown prison?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you. I hail from Sydney, so I'm currently in a snap lockdown that was meant to last for 2 weeks, and we've just had an extension today, so we're not quite sure when we're going to be let free yet.
Wow, I mean, that's incredible. Like, how's the daily situation, though? Like, you can go out of your house, you have to wear masks on the streets. What are the restrictions like?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of talk internationally about Australia. We have two very different cities. We've got Melbourne, which is in Victoria, which seems to enjoy being locked down, and people are quite compliant down there. They always wear their masks even if they don't have to. And then you have Sydney, where I'm from, and Sydney-siders do not like being locked down. So, for instance, they ditched public transport, not because they are frightened of virus, because they don't want to have to wear masks. So there's a lot of frustration, a lot of very angry business owners, and there was a big emergency meeting with our treasurer yesterday to discuss urgent ways of supporting businesses during this pandemic, because we no longer have JobKeeper. So everyone's just closed and nowhere to pay their staff.
Yeah, it's a horrible situation. We'll be getting into that. And I do the same. I avoid absolutely anywhere I have to wear a mask. I just don't go there. And, if that means buying online and accelerating the Great Reset, then so be it sometimes. I don't know.
Finding the QR code for every location we go in, even if we want to shop for food. So you see all these poor little old ladies there trying to work out how to sign in with the QR code on their phone. It's a nightmare.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into your article. I've never heard of you until somehow I found this article, which was amazing. And the article covers what I've been talking a lot about: the Great Reset, Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, the numerous pandemic warm-up simulations prior to the declaration of COVID as a public health emergency, the move from COVID to climate change, and the coming cyber polygon or cyber pandemic. Now, every day I scan through articles that touch on these subjects, and most of them I skip because they don't give me any new info. But your piece was really well put together and brought all of these topics together in a unique and eloquent way that made perfect sense. I tend to think chronologically. So when I look at these issues, I always start with the pandemic simulations. It's interesting that recently The Guardian brought to light yet another pandemic simulation that the UK ran in 2016 called Exercise Alice, which specifically wargamed the coronavirus. So now we're up to at least 7 pandemic simulations, 3 of which were specifically for coronavirus between 2016 and 2019, right in the run-up to COVID. So I don't know if you want to start by commenting, more on the pandemic, the lockdowns, or the pandemic simulations, or somewhere else. But the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, you didn't see the other 40 pages that was in that article before I cut it back down again. I had to get rid of all of the economic discussions because that's just as frightening, and I was going to put that in another article. The problem when you've got something like the World Economic Forum and the bureaucracy with plans and engaging things is that they don't hide what they're up to. They publish millions and millions of pages and have infinite seminars. So it's almost like it's hiding in plain sight and nobody can bother to actually read what they're doing. It's not a secret. It's just so much data. And so with my article, what I was trying to do is cut through just the sheer forest information and try and pinpoint a few key things to open up the floor of discussion to people who might not be aware of what's going on, or to at least bring them up to speed with the basic level of how things have flown from the climate change into the COVID pandemic and now into what will be a digital problem later on. And the digital world, I've worked in IT for my whole life, and trying to explain to people how fragile the digital world is a constant struggle, because people see the cloud, they think it's everywhere, it's always on their phone. They don't understand that it's actually all built on real physical hardware that's just as vulnerable as any other physical attribute inside a nation. And so, yeah, that was my purpose, was to try and introduce people to it. And it did go viral. That's probably how you found it. And I read 2 of Klaus Schwab's mind-numbing books. I don't know if you've read his work before, but he's a terrible, terrible writer. And trying to flick through to some of the more alarming discussions that he's having within his books. And yeah, that's what I was up to.
So we've got 3 apocalypses, as you say: pandemic, COVID, climate, and the digital darkness, as you call it. What actually this Friday is the cyber polygon, so I'm kind of like worried a bit. So
next week it'll be a blackout everywhere. There'll be no phones, no banking, and I'll just have a big "I told you so" sign stuck in front of my Twitter account.
Well, I think they'll probably wait maybe until at least late July, August to September. And so for me, the pandemic simulations is one of the big things, the keys. The fact that there are probably more. I've counted 7 of these right in the run up to 2020, and 3 were specifically for coronavirus. So for me, that's like a dead giveaway that, however you see the COVID pandemic, that this was planned. They were planning for this and practicing. And whether it was, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the problem with the cyber polygon and other events where you dry run a simulation, it's the exact same problem that you have with war games. So if you play physical war games with your natural geopolitical enemies, they get to watch how you react to certain scenarios, and you don't bring out your secret weapons and parade them off to China and be like, hey, this is what we got, mate. You don't do it. The same thing is true with a digital pandemic. If you're talking about a hacking event or some kind of digital insecurity, then the last thing you do is go and show everybody of the world leaders, hey, this is our problems. Here's what we're going to discuss today. You wouldn't do it. And so that's why I find it amusing to watch these world leaders gather up cyber pandemic. You're like, no, that you wouldn't do it if you were seriously that was your problem. But what they are doing, which is a deeper layer, which I think most people miss, is when you train world leaders to react to a scenario, which they'd normally be unpredictable, you introduce a predictability that other bureaucracies can then write policies and legislations for and allow for. So if we'd had no pandemic dry runs, we would have seen a very different world emerge from the COVID pandemic, because countries would have had to look at their people, listen to what their parliaments were saying, and then come up with their own solutions for each country. And we would have had more Swedens and less of this brute mentality we see. But if you train all the world leaders, hey, this is your purpose, and you hand little sheets of paper saying, do this, do this, do this, then you're going to get a united response. Whether that's good or bad, it'll certainly be at the direction of people running these dry runs. Yeah,
see, this is why I like your writing. And so, like, you kind of explained a bit more of something that hadn't come up in previous conversations that I've had with guests. So basically you're saying then by running these drills or simulations, they kind of come up with a rough draft of what to do when the thing happens. And then that gets disseminated, from the international institutions down to the, UN state members. And then they just kind of, like you say, they don't know what to do. So they kind of run with this draft plan. Is that kind of it?
It's no different to being on an airplane and you've got the little hostess at the front saying, here are your exits, here and here, wear seatbelts. Well, in a crisis, weak leaders, which is what we've got across the West, is very weak leaders and not very smart ones. They will follow a figure of authority, and the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and other bureaucracies have set themselves up as the system of authority, and our leaders are following their authoritative commands.
So then if we go to the second apocalypse, I recently had on a Canadian chap, Terry Wolf, whose TikTok videos have been going absolutely viral. He talked about how Davos and company are now attempting to shift us from the global problem of pandemic to climate, but still, I think they're going to keep the pandemic forever on the back burner for the rest of our lives. Every few years they're going to pop up. Oh, here's another epidemiological threat or whatever. But the pandemic lemon cannot be squeezed forever, at least not as they've done it in the past year, I think. So could you talk a bit your view on the shift now from COVID to climate?
Well, you're quite correct. The socialist-led bureaucracy of some of our world institutions, their goal is to dismantle the idea of national sovereignty and the autonomy of individual nations, because it makes it hard to govern and it kind of interferes with their little global socialist dream they've had for the last 100 or so years. So they're looking for ways to do that. Now, Western countries are successful. So capitalism was supposed to fall. That was always the great Marxist dream, that capitalism would outrun itself and it would collapse, but of course it does. And so they've had to come up with ways to nudge a collapse of capitalism. And so they do this by working out ways to make politicians turn their nations into more authoritative nations, and also to hand over power from the political process internally into treaties and international agreements which usurp domestic law. Now, Jonathan Sumption in the UK has written a lot about this. It's the overreach of international law into normal politics. It's beside the point. So these things like the COVID pandemic and climate change are bundles of international treaties and laws which have been then backwriting policies inside, like Australia, for instance. Our energy portfolios, for instance, are now full of these international treaties, and very little of it's actually been agreed upon by the people. Every time they run an election on it, they lose, but they still keep writing the policies. And so what they've worked out is that it's very difficult to make Western nations give up their prosperity and to give up their liberty. So they've had to come up with ways to frighten them into it, and I call that apocalypse politics, when you use the human instinct to survive as a way of initiating a permanent war economy on nations. And they tried it with climate change. It didn't really work because the threat was never, it's getting cold. I'm here in Sydney. It's absolutely freezing. There's no things melting. It's no global apocalypse. So they tried COVID, and because they had real deaths and it came out of China, which the West is naturally frightened of, it worked a lot better. But even that's wearing off people who don't want to give up their businesses. They don't want to give up their homes. They want their children to be educated. And so that's losing power. And the one that will really get them is a digital apocalypse, because unlike the other two, you really can destroy nations if you take out their basic levels of infrastructure. It's like taking out the water, like the water Asian politics that we've got going on. Take out the internet and we've got some serious problems.
Yeah, before getting to that third apocalypse, just to hang on a bit on the global bureaucracy, as you call it. I think I had some quotes I wanted to read. You as you said, you were kind of summarizing this in the article. You said, quote, "The purpose of climate change, COVID, and the new hype digital pandemic is to artificially induce, as you said, a permanent war economy for these global treaties." And that's what they mean by phrases like Build Back Better, Great Reset, changing mindsets, redefining capitalism, the fourth industrial revolution, or as I call it, the fourth industrial Reich. We're all in this together, sustainable future. And you say that climate change is the only narrative capable of achieving mass state land grabs and control of global food production, two essential requirements of a global socialist bureaucracy, end quote. So, I mean, basically, is this the age-old dream mankind has had since its inception, that of, total global domination? That's what all the emperors of old, Alexandra the Great and everyone were trying to achieve, to dominate the entire planet, a Babylon of sorts, a world empire or global government, Is that kind of where they're headed?
Well, the thing with the ancient emperors, with any kind of egotistical warlord, is they are far less trouble than an international bureaucracy. I'll grant you that, because once they're done conquering, they pretty much leave the citizenry alone. And people like Alexander the Great and the Roman emperors, they wanted to make money. So they were perfectly happy for citizens to go out and trade and be productive. But this global entity is not like that. It's sort of like a parasite that leeches off everything you make and makes everyone poorer. So this is not so much the conquest desires of individual dictators. It is the old socialist dream of a one world order. I mean, it is literally world domination, Bond style. And you've got Klaus Schwab standing up there like a literal Bond villain. And they want to be able to take money and write policy for the whole world. And it really does come down to siphoning wealth off productive individuals and moving it into a small handful of private corporations and politicians and bureaucrats. Now, the one thing that underpins this, and this comes from the study of English liberty and history, is private property is the basis of freedom and wealth. And so if citizens don't have private property, they have very little recourse against governments. And so a lot of these global warming and climate change policies relate to pushing people off farmland and agricultural land and locking up national parks. And so the pool of land available to the citizen gets smaller and smaller as they urbanize us into cities, whereas the land transfers into the hand of trusts, like we've got our Indigenous trusts here, which are going to hold about, I think it's 40 to 50% of Australia very shortly. And then we've got the government trusts, which own large tracts of national parks and public land. So the free citizens are having less and less private property, and so we have less and less power against the state. Now that underpins every society, no matter how advanced you are or how cool you think you are. Or, that's primary.
Yeah, and we see this like with, I talked about this in the past podcasts I've had, where they're trying to strip us of our private vehicles, so they're not making gas cars anymore after 2030. They're stripping car lanes.
On that one, Australia tried that. That's a big one for Australia, because you guys, like, not in particular, but in like small European countries, they can force you to have electric cars. They can take away your cars because everything's in walkable distance. But Australia, they ran the last big election on that one. And they want us to all have e-cars and all these different taxes. And we're like, do you know how big Australia is? Like, it's about, 9 days to the other side of the country. We can't do it on an e-car. It's not going to work. So there was a huge backlash toward that. And we're not uptaking electric vehicles no matter how much you push us.
Yeah, and also as well, like Biden just said he's going to, mark off 30% of the U.S., as you were saying, what they were talking about in Australia, they're going to save 30% of U.S. land for, I guess, conservation or whatever. So we see this trend pushing forward, private vehicles. And Spain, I don't know if you've heard that, just quite shocking now. Spain is now talking about a law where they can force anyone now to do anything. I guess work for free, be drafted into the military, and even expropriate property, which is insane. Like they could just expropriate property now.
Well, look what they do with the property. So they say, or they take the property under the idea of it's the environment we're protecting, we're saving the planet, right? It's all about saving the world. But if you look at what's happened in England, now I am an ambassador for the constitutional monarchy in Australia, so I am on board with the concept of constitutional monarchies. But if you look at the actual, the way that the public land is now being treated, they've got the royal family to use all of the waters outside the UK and many of the national parks there as wind turbine factories, which the profits, of course, go to the big companies that are at the UN and part of the global warming climate crisis, money-making operations. So they abscond land that was public and then use it to make money off their renewables technology. And so it always comes back down to somebody's making profit off this. It is not philanthropic.
Yeah, and we also see what they're doing in the U.S. As they're bankrupting farmers and businesses. They're having to sell off their land, and Bill Gates and all these people are buying it up. So our chunk of the pie keeps getting smaller. So maybe going now.
They tax me for theoretical goats on my property, so they tax us for everything. So the way that the Australian farmers get taxed for their land is absolutely ridiculous. We pay so much out, and we get no services. I've still got a dirt road, but I'm supposed to have an e-car.
That's why I moved to somewhere like Mexico, where the property taxes and stuff are dirt cheap. But I'm sure they're going to be coming after us at some point. So this week, so as I said, at the end of this week is the cyber pandemic simulation, Cyber Polygon. NATO ran a cyber simulation in April, I think, and I think as well as the U.S. military ran another simulation as well. And as we've mentioned before, this syndicate, as I'll call them, they ran the coronavirus pandemic simulation event 201 in October 2019. And so just 2 to 3 months later was the real thing. So as we were talking about before, I'm betting that starting late July, August, September, end of 2021, start of 2022, we're going to start seeing some severe internet and infrastructure failures. In fact, just yesterday, a big bank in Turkey went down for more than 24 hours, which is the longest that's ever happened in Turkey to a bank. And there's an excellent researcher on Twitter with the handle Cyber Attack 2020 who pointed out that the European Systemic Cyber Group has run scenarios on, quote, the permanent destruction of account balance information at a large multinational bank, end quote. So basically, our bank accounts could be wiped out with no copies, they can just wipe out our entire savings. And so, the COVID dictatorship has forever destroyed lives and people's ability to provide for themselves. And, I'm afraid that, as you mentioned before, this digital darkness is really going to hurt us. It's like they're punching us when we're down. And so, how do you see going forward, after Friday, the Cyber Polygon passes, what do you foresee the things that trends that we might see going forward?
Well, one of the things that prompted me to actually write this article, because I've had it sitting around for a while and I thought, no, I really should get around and actually write it, was a couple of weeks ago, Australia had a run of digital problems with its banking industry. I think you guys saw some of it where websites like Netflix and Amazon and big international sites all went down. We also lost our banking sector, so all of our major banks went down. It was twice in a week. And people started to think to themselves, well, because we've gone to an almost cashless society down here, they actually tried to pass regulations to limit our cash payment values here. People are heavily reliant on it. And even during the COVID, they've got regulations where most stores now won't accept cash. And so when the banks go down, suddenly you can't purchase anything. People start to think to themselves, wow, that could be a problem. But as always, it comes back up online. Everyone just moves on with their lives and doesn't think about what that actually means. And with the banking problem, there's not as much security in your accounts as people think there is. As I said, they've all consolidated their servers into third-party large corporations. So when I was starting out in software, most companies, even like the shoe company I used to work for, they bought their own servers. Everyone had infrastructure that they purchased, and it was decentralized, right? We used to manage people's servers. And now people just rent server space on Amazon or AWS. And so when one party goes down, lots of fundamental services go down. So there's no sort of protection from the crowd and different opinions. It's like having a hive of one queen you can take down and kill everyone. Same thing. And with that, people don't realize how significant it is. So I don't think it was Canada. I don't have it in my article there, but one of the Canadian politicians leaked conversations from within their parliament about Canada toying with the idea of erasing people's debt in exchange for property if anything was to happen to the banking sector. It was a big story, I think, a year or so ago. That's the thing. If the banks go down, there will have to be a deal struck to placate the very angry masses about, well, maybe we'll erase your debt, but we'll sort things out. And there's a whole other economic conversation going on, debt bubbles and green bond problems, and this new economic bubbles forming that it would suit a lot of people to crash the global economy with a bit of a digital accident.
That's funny, that point you just mentioned. So I was chatting with one of my listeners on my Telegram channel because I posted that news story about the Turkish bank and the cyber pandemic, being early. It's 2 days before the cyber polygon. And I was saying that this would actually serve the elites. And the listener was saying, well, no, then they would also wipe people's debts. But I think for them, that's a small price to pay, because if, our savings get wiped, but so do our debts, what's going to happen? We're going to go full on into the cashless society. They're talking about the central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. And so once they get us onto the CBDC digital platform, they've got us. There's no escape.
That's what I tried to explain, because this is not an economic article I sent that you've read. I had tried to keep it digital. But the whole point of them acquiring assets like property and mining interests and gold and energy infrastructure, it's because they don't need money. So if they wipe the cash economy out, they still hold the physical possessions, the physical value of the assets, whereas you don't. And so if they were to reset, they would actually probably tip out on top. Now, in that one, I do mention briefly that during the Y2K event, where everyone panicked about, an apocalypse, and we all were dressed up in glitter and went down to the Harbour Bridge and basically strapped firework to our bridge. That's how we celebrated our panic. People were trying very hard to avoid it. There was no benefit in the Y2K event coming around. But this time, a lot of powerful people do stand to benefit from a digital disaster. And so we don't have as much protection from the market trying to stop it from happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And to look then into our crystal balls beyond, in the aftermath of cyber polygon and whenever the cyber pandemic happens, I was just reading, for example, just this week they announced, Windows 11 is just around the corner. I think in 2 years, less than 2 years, 2023. And Microsoft has said Windows 11 will require absolutely front-facing webcams. So a lot of people are going to have to, and only two special kinds of processors, like what is it called? The Intel i8 Coffee Lake and another processor. So if your computer doesn't have the webcam and the processor, you have to get a new laptop or device. And now we're seeing things where banks are requiring geolocation to be turned on to access your bank account. Governments are now requiring the registry of biometrics to use your SIM mobile card. And so for me, it seems like one of the goals after the cyber pandemic is to have a very much more controlled internet experience where we won't be able to log on like we are now. What's your vision of the world after the cyber polygon if the masters of the universe get their way?
Well, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago. I haven't checked the date now, but I do remember seeing that Microsoft was toying around with the idea of, by the way, if you hear any drilling, it's because I've got builders here. Microsoft was toying around with the idea of you rent their software now instead of download. So no more disks, you actually download their software onto your computer. And they were saying, hey, if you write something they disagree with, then they can suspend your Microsoft Word session, which for a writer, you'd be sitting there going, what do you mean you can suspend my service if you don't like what I'm writing? And that was the first sort of warning that things were going on the wrong track with the way corporations were starting to interfere with political discussions amongst people instead of just being a service that they sell you. So that was the first time I noticed it. As far as the future goes, I know that we're talking about how bureaucracy and digital authoritarianism will be used to trap people. But I actually think it'll be more simple than that. Sorry, I didn't explain that very well. What they're trying to do is they tried to coerce us with COVID. They tried to coerce us with climate change. And they see a digital pandemic as the way to finally force democracies and free citizens to give up their freedom, right? A China-style social justice. But I reckon we'll actually fall into a global hot geo-conflict first, and that our real apocalypse will actually simply be someone like China having a go at the servers to cause disruption for the West. So I think our problems are actually going to be physical, even though we're all panicking about digital authoritarianism. Like, we should worry about both, but my bet, if I was to press money on it, I would say it's going to be a physical problem.
Yeah, that was related to my next question. So, my views have been evolving like everyone's, which we should, presented with new information, we should be changing our opinions. I personally don't see any political leaders or countries really opposed to this Great Reset in earnest. All key institutions and corporations are signed on. It seems some point to Putin or
I think you're totally on track there. I think you're completely right. There's no resistance from any of our leaders because it's not a political point yet. And so until it becomes a point of politics, they won't care.
Right. So yeah, like this cyber polygon is having a lot of Russian. What is it? The Russian Sberbank, the prime minister of Russia, is involved, and I'm further convinced that it seems the only squabble Russia and China have regarding the Great Reset is that their share of the pie is too small, perhaps. So, would that be then the reason for the conflict you're discussing?
The geopolitics in Asia there is extremely complicated because you've got China and Russia wanting to be leaders of the world, basically. But then you've got India sitting underneath them, and India is basically the size of China, and they are not on board with a world led by either Russia or China. But then you've got also China controlling some of the major geopolitical hinges against India, like their water politics and their Belt and Road projects, et cetera, et cetera. But the interesting player is Russia, because Russia has a special relationship with India. And Russia also knows that a world run by the West and the US, they can deal with, they can do business with, and the US isn't going to come there and take over Russia or whatever. They know what the world looks like. But a world run by China and communist authoritarianism that's been cuddling up to the Islamic world and the religious authoritarianism there, which is run by dictators, etc. That's a world that I'm not convinced that Russia really wants to empower in earnest. And so I'm not sure that the way that the world conflict has been pegged out is what's going to happen. Because I think if push comes to shove, Russia will actually hold back from the switch with China, because China doesn't have borders or limits. And once they're done with the West, they'll go after Russia. So if the geopolitical conflict comes through, I think they'll go after the undersea cables or some kind of disruptive event like a server house in order to give themselves advantage in a conflict like Taiwan, for instance.
Yeah, I've definitely seen views, as you just mentioned, and it's possible. Like we've seen in previous world wars in history, countries switch sides, and so I'm not ruling anything out. It's we're in the fog here, trying to make sense of what's going on. I wanted to get also perhaps your comments on politicians. And it seems in all countries, when I listen to, for example, my Croatian representatives or the Canadian governors, or I'm here in Mexico, or the Mexican politicians or the Asians. We mentioned before, all their speech and prescriptions are exactly the same. And I personally can't believe that they are generally incompetent. As you said, well, maybe some of them are, but for me, it seems that they must know really what's going on and what they are doing. And I think they're lying through their teeth. Perhaps some are blackmailed or threatened, but I'd say most seem content to think of themselves as part of the elite godhood and happy to execute these sinister global plans. You say in your most recent article, I think, quote, leaders quite enjoy giving daily press conferences to remind everyone how important they are, end quote, and that, quote, Western leaders are trying out COVID socialism and getting addicted to it, end quote. So, what are your thoughts in general about our politicians carrying out these programs, and whether you're seeing in Australia or elsewhere any hope or resistance, pushback?
Well, the first rule of politicians is they love to be important. They need to be needed. And Australian politicians, it's not like the US or even the UK. Australians don't pay any attention to their politicians except in a very short period of time around the election. We would rather never see and never hear from our politicians. They're not celebrities. When I was growing up, we almost never discussed politics. We'd elect a prime minister and he'd sulk off and do his job for the country. It wasn't a sideshow. It wasn't a theatre production. Not at all. And now all of our health ministers and all of our minor premiers, they are loving giving all these long 4-hour press conferences to the Australian public and being on demand 24/7. They love it. They don't want it to end ever because they're still being paid. But I miss the time when our politicians, the biggest scandal was the honey trapping that Asia used to do, where they'd go off, do naughty things up in Asia and then come back, and that was the level of corruption you had to worry about. Now we've got politicians who are being promised international importance, not even fame. They love going to the UN, and because we're a smaller country, they love being like, oh, we're at this conference, we're at this thing, we're mixing with all this wealth and celebrity. They can't help it. It's the trappings of the red carpet. But when you talk about them not being smart, I have to say, the more politicians I meet and speak with at length, the more I'm convinced that they're actually not very bright. A lot of them, it's the bureaucracy that runs what they're up to, and they are just figureheads for what they're told to say. And they are genuinely stupid. I find it so hard to believe they're part of a conspiracy, given what I've seen them say when they're behind closed doors. I think if there is a conspiracy, it's definitely up in other nations, and our Australian politicians are more or less following along. But it's just so about politicians. The internet's difficult. I mean, for an economic thing, sure, they're far more likely to be involved in international collaborations. But most of our politicians think the internet starts and begins at their Facebook page, and that's about as far as they get for understanding the digital environment. So that's why, as you said, the Polygon event's so dangerous for them, because they don't know how to handle a digital scenario. And so if they're told to do something, they're just going to do exactly what they are told to do in one of these dry runs.
Yeah,
they can't even get free speech. They don't even understand platform law for social media companies. So they don't understand a digital apocalypse.
Yeah, I would agree with you that politicians many are not very intelligent. Although I guess my point would be then that I think after a while they would kind of realize, after 6 months into the pandemic, 12 months, looking at the case-demic and locking down, they kind of realize, what we're doing is not making any sense. So what's really going on?
Let me clarify that. So they may not understand it, but if they work out how to make money or power or gain power out of it, they will use that without ever understanding it properly. But here's a case in point. I mean, I got suspended from Twitter yesterday for 10 hours because I asked a question about COVID. Now, our government doesn't care that citizens are being suspended from Twitter. The chief health officer of Melbourne blocked me for questioning his health advice. So we've got our politicians blocking citizens on social media digital platforms who are supposed to be giving us access to health advice.
So much for the free speech. To get your thoughts maybe on first looking at the worst case scenario and then, looking whether you're optimistic or not. I think you wrote a piece for the Good Sauce, this other website that you have about the UK turning itself I guess into a hell. It seems like, as I mentioned before, all the world's politicians are out to kill us or destroy us. A governor in Mexico recently said that if a business doesn't follow COVID protocols, they will be permanently shut down. As I mentioned before, in Spain, they're already talking about expropriating property. You've already mentioned and written about the goal of Build Back Better is to destroy private business and private property. I've been reading articles where in some places like New Zealand or Australia that people are getting kicked out of McDonald's because their phones can't scan the QR codes. In the US, they're talking about going door to door to push experimental injections. A friend in Kazakhstan just informed me that you will no longer be able to work full time anywhere if you are not inoculated. And so, it's really kind of starting to feel like we're entering into some kind of apocalyptic endgame. How far down this road do you feel we might go? How bad might it get?
Oh, I'll tell you why I'm more worried about the geopolitical threat to digital security. Because the first threat, which is digital authoritarianism, I seriously believe that the bureaucracy has underestimated the Western spirit, which is coming out of the Old English liberty. These people have clearly never picked up a history book, because in the end, you cannot constrain anybody of European, particularly English descent, because it never works. We refuse to. We'll go along with things for a while because we're generally law-abiding citizens. That's part of our culture, is we don't like to tear apart our government if we don't have to. We would rather just them reform themselves and try to get to do it on their own. But if push comes to shove, Europeans are some of the most resilient to tyranny and the most prepared to completely dismantle their systems if they have to. And we're already seeing freedom marches. We're already seeing, like even in Australia, vocal opposition and on the street opposition, open defiance of these medical mandates. And every time the police crack down on a defiant, it doesn't play well at all. So I wrote a piece for Rebel News last week about a poor pensioner who was slammed against a police van, not wearing a mask at a health food store out in the agricultural area, like nowhere near an outbreak, in a place there's never been a COVID case. And people watch this heavy-handed policing and go, you know what, I think maybe you're on the wrong track. And I reckon that world leaders are seeing that they're losing their grip on society and that COVID isn't enough for people to give over to digital authoritarianism. And the harder they push, I think the more obvious it will become to politicians that is not going to be the way forward. Every move, like they've just talked about in a meeting yesterday in Australia about allowing businesses access to vaccination information of their employees. Now, that didn't go down with the unions. It didn't go down with the citizens. We don't want centralised data. We don't want to be controlled. We want our QR codes gone. We don't want to keep checking into businesses. It's not going to stick. So I can see it falling apart and shaking apart. It's not going to happen. Whereas you have to ask, what do geopolitics want? And there's a lot of motivation for a geopolitical threat to actually bring down our technological systems, because the goal is solid, and they've already said they want things like Taiwan, they want to invade. Well, they are real reasons to do it, and we're not prepared to handle it. So that's why I worry about them.
What scenario would you see? I mean, would that be basically World War III? You know, would that involve a nuclear exchange, more biological warfare? What's your thought there?
Well, every generation loves to think that they've evolved beyond war, always. At the beginning, just before the outbreak of World War I, some of the great writers were saying that, now that we're a heavily integrated world and we've got all this production and manufacturing, it's too integrated, we're never going to go to war. And then we had two of the biggest wars in human history off the back of that. Whenever you get giant civilizations shifting power bases, you always get conflict. It is inevitable, particularly if you've got an expansionist communist power who knows that they have to continue to expand or they will internally collapse. And Xi Jinping's got a lot of internal problems, and when they are financially dependent upon gaining resources. Otherwise, there's just not enough economics in China to support the people. So there is going to be a conflict there one way or another. It's inevitable. I know people like to say, World War III is never going to happen. It will. It just depends on how severe it will actually be. And so in the case of a global conflict, you can bet your sweet life that they're going to go after the most vulnerable part of their opposition, which will be Western information technology. I mean, they were still letting China make the guided chips in missiles only 2 years ago. So we've had to, decouple ourselves and start protecting ourselves digitally from a conflict. And the US government is aware of that.
I would agree with your assessment. I think peace is the anomaly and war is the default, human nature. I've interviewed, you probably know, Ricardo Bossi from Australia, and he said war is coming as well. Gregory Copley, he's an Australian who also, I think, supports constitutional monarchy. He's been on my show a few times, the head of a defense studies institute. And they all agree that, war is coming. I think it's inevitable. The question is when and what it's going to look like. I guess we're just going to have to grab some popcorn and...
That's how we organize ourselves. We may not like it, but that is the constant story of humanity.
All right. Any final thoughts? Any other points, topics you want to cover, or any final thoughts for us?
Only that I'm glad you contacted me because I wasn't aware of your platform either. And you guys run a great show, a lot of interesting content. I'm going to be following you closely in the future. Not stalking, just following your content, particularly as we run up to the Cyber Polygon and see what else you guys have to say about that.
All right. It's not guys. It's just a guy. It's just me. It's a skeleton crew, a one-man show. I do everything. And so, yeah. And hopefully I'm going to be expanding this year now that I'll be working full-time on the podcast. So listeners, stay tuned and help me out with that. Where are the great
becoming omnipresent? You look like more than one person.
I guess that's a good, tactic, that's a classical, war strategy. My uncle fought in the Yugoslav war. He was one of the first on the border with Serbia, Vukovar. He was one of the first volunteers to defend Vukovar. And they said that at the time there were only a few dozen Croats versus more than 1,000 Serbs. But the Serbs, the Croats did tactics to make it seem like there were 1,000 Croats when there were only a few dozen. So that allowed them to hold off Vukovar for a while from the Serbs because they didn't know the real number.
I was going to put this in a future article, so I'll give you a sneak preview. Doesn't matter how large your opponent is, they're only as good as their infrastructure. And while the West might have vulnerable digital infrastructure, places like China have vulnerable water infrastructure. And so there's no certain outcomes in any kind of future global conflict.
All right. Yeah, water is becoming a big topic now. Where are the best places for people to find you online? I'll include them in the description.
So Twitter is my primary form of shouting at the universe. I have my blog where I post all of my updates. So wherever I write, I always come back and post on the blog, which is also linked there. I've got some merch if you guys want to wear some hilarious protesting style merchandise. All the proceeds go to helping me. Like you, I'm an independent writer. So anyone who wants to support me is welcome to. I use it to buy myself coffee and pay the rent. Yes, you can follow me on those two. Oh, I got Facebook too as well.
All right. I'm not posting anymore to my podcast Facebook because they've restricted it, so nobody sees it. So it's a waste of time. And hopefully I'll start getting some merch out eventually as well. All right, Alexandra Marshall. Everyone follow her excellent work on Twitter, on the articles she writes for The Spectator in Australia, her website, Ellie Melly, and goodsauce.news. Thanks for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast interview. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list through which you can receive an update of every new podcast, as well as a long list of key news headlines once a week. We're being heavily censored. YouTube has deleted some of our videos, and we currently have one strike. Patreon has terminated our account. Facebook has restricted our page, and Reddit has been deleting posts. Our favorite social media channels are Telegram and Twitter. The best places to watch the podcast beyond YouTube are on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon. The best places to listen to the podcast are on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, Google, or on any other podcast app. To help keep this podcast alive, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and wherever else. Subscribe to all our platforms and leave a donation if possible via Subscribestar, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum. You can also find us on MeWe, Minds, Gab, Float, VK, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.